Hello everyone, my name is Ant. I am currently a PhD candidate from the Department of Linguistics, Macquarie University. Today I'm going to present to you one study under my PhD research project, which is on the role of pragmatic competence in intercultural communications perceived by Vietnamese EFL teacher educators. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge the sponsorship of Macquarie University for my PhD study, and I'm grateful to my supervisor, Dr. Chiong Mari, for her support and guidance, as well as to all Vietnamese EFL teacher educators who participated in this study. Now let me start with the rationale for this study. So first of all, it is well recognized in research that teacher quality is crucial to any educational innovation. This is the reason why in 2008, under the National Foreign Language Project 2020, which has been extended to 2025, the Vietnamese government put an emphasis on teacher quality in their efforts of innovating the foreign language teaching and learning system in the nation. One more reason for this research is that there has been unidentified positives of pragmatic input in EFL textbook worldwide and Vietnamese EFL textbook. This kind of shortage of pragmatic information in the textbook require teachers to be more active in integrating pragmatic teachings in their practices. So given the important role that teachers had to play in teaching L2 pragmatics to their students, no studies has been found that has a focus on the teaching of L2 pragmatics to pre-service teachers in EFL context in general and in the EFL context of Vietnam in particular. Now let me continue with a brief reviews of the literatures on important issues in this study. So first of all, I would like to talk about the framework of L2 pragmatic competence developed by Kunpieper, Maki, and Taguchi 2018. So according to this author, L2 pragmatic competence consists of three main components. The first component is called pragmatics within individuals. So in these components, L2 users are required to have knowledge of pragmalinguistics and social pragmatics, as well as the ability to map these two types of knowledge onto each other to comprehend messages directed to them and to produce appropriate linguistic form in various social settings. So let me give you a brief example of what this means. So for example, in communicating with others, if L2 user would like to make a request, they need to know the structures to make a request, right? And they need to know like what kind of request, whether it should be informal or formal requests that they need to make in some settings of their interaction. And the second components of L2 pragmatics competence is called pragmatics in interaction in context. So this is divided the abilities of interaction in making meanings, including negotiating and co-constructing meanings, as well as detecting the change in a range of contextual elements. So for example, in communication with other people, that's the ability of how to make meaning across to each other, how to make things become clear to each other is very important. Also in interaction, there is often some kind of changes or shift in terms of the type of language people use, which can be from formal into informal or vice versa, or there can be some changes in attitudes of the interlocutor, and so L2 users need to be able to have the ability to comprehend the changes during the changes of contextual element during their interactions, as well as how to negotiate with other people to make meaning across. For example, during the interaction with other people, sometimes we can't understand each other on some issues. So how can the L2 users, makes the meaning become clearer and to correct misunderstanding or to avoid communication breakdown, etc. And the third component is called pragmatic in intercultural communication. So as you know, nowadays intercultural communication is a common mode of communication in which we have more opportunities. I mean, we experience more times of speaking to people from different linguistics and cultural background. So this kind of ability is very important. So how can we manage communication and interaction with people who don't share the common grounds of social, cultural belief and norm? So how can we understand people, and how can we accept and the different in terms of social cultural norms. So in this study of mine, this kind of framework is adopted to investigate the teacher-educator knowledge of L2 pragmatics, to see to them what does L2 pragmatics competence consist of. The second issue that I would like to mention in this literature reviews is teacher cognition in pragmatics. So the term teacher cognition refers to what teachers think, know, and believe, and the relationship of these mental constructs to what teachers do in the language teaching classroom. So in this study, I look at the teacher-educator's knowledge, belief, and practices of L2 pragmatics to pre-service teacher. So this line of research on teacher cognition on pragmatics is quite limited in the Vietnamese EFL context. On those hand, there has been some study on teacher cognition on different contents. For example, there has been study on teacher cognition on speaking pedagogy, teacher belief, and actual classrooms practice of effective EFL instruction, as well as teacher perception and experiences of blending learning, or teacher cognition in teacher research engagements, etc. But there has not been any study that tapped into teacher cognition on L2 pragmatics in the specific context of Vietnam, and as well as in other contexts. This kind of topic is also under research. On those recently in Vietnam, there has been one study which investigated into Vietnamese EFL teacher educator cognition of L2 pragmatics by Vũ 2017, but these studies focused on the teachings of L2 pragmatic to non-English major students, not to pre-service teachers. You can see that this is a different focus, because in teaching L2 pragmatic to pre-service teachers, teacher educators have to pay attention to developing the L2 pragmatic competence for pre-service teachers as language users, but also they need to pay attention to the development of this kind of knowledge to pre-service teachers as the person who will become future teachers and who will teach those kinds of knowledge to their future students. So from the proof literature reviews of this kind of topics in the Vietnamese EFL context, it could be seen that a positive in this line of research in Vietnam is clearly a constraint on both the literature and practice of L2 pragmatic teaching in this context. Because the understanding of teacher knowledge and belief about this issue could bring insight into what and how L2 pragmatics is integrated into teacher-educator pragmatics teaching practices to preserve a teacher in this context. And as can be seen in Figure 1 above, L2 pragmatic competence has included more aspects and knowledge when it's come to intercultural communication, or English as a lingua franca. It is important to know what the teacher educator understand about L2 pragmatic competence in order to have a proper way to facilitate preserving teachers' development of L2 pragmatic competence. Therefore, in this study, the following research questions were developed. So the first one is about what do Vietnamese teacher educators think about the roles of L2 pragmatic competence in intercultural communication. Question number 2 is about what do Vietnamese teacher educators know and believe about the constituents of L2 pragmatic competence in relation to intercultural communication. And the third question is about what is the relationship between teacher educator knowledge, belief, and practices of L2 pragmatic teaching. In order to answer these research questions, this study adopts the qualitative case studies approach, and it follows a single case study design, which means this is a within size study, and this study has the participation of a group of 14 teacher educators from universities in Vietnam, and the data collection was completed during 1 month, in which the researcher visited this university and worked with these teacher educators on these research projects. And the instruments used in this study include a pre-interview online questionnaire, which is followed by semi-structured interviews on L2 pragmatic teaching with the participants. And also, the researchers has the opportunity to observe some of the teacher educators' classroom in order to compare between their knowledge, belief, and their classroom practices. So for those teachers who participated in classroom observation, they need to participate in pre-lesson interview, and then the researcher observes the class, and after that those teachers also needed to write a reflection notes on their classrooms. So now let me talk about my research findings. So to the first research question, which is about the teacher educators' rating of the role of L2 pragmatic competence in intercultural communication, it was found that overall all of the teacher educators in the study highlighted the importance of pragmatic competence in the overall communicative competence. This means that all of the teacher educators in this study were fully aware of the important role of L2 pragmatic competence. Therefore, they all emphasize the importance of the teaching and learnings of pragmatics. However, their explanation for their opinion reveals some of their important beliefs about the teaching of pragmatics as follows. So furthermore, most teacher educators in this study consider that the teaching of pragmatics needed to be interwoven with the teaching of linguistic features, and thus at a higher level, students definitely needed to have pragmatic competence. This means that to the teacher educator, they thought that pragmatic teachings is only possible when students have higher knowledge of linguistics. This is really a constraint to their pedagogies, because this leads them to the decision that they need to postpone L2 pragmatic teaching until their student could reach a certain level of English proficiencies. So you can see that this kind of belief is contrary to current understandings of L2 pragmatic teaching, because in research, it is well known that L2 pragmatic teaching needs to be taught to students at all levels, and beginners are not, the cases that don't need to study about L2 pragmatics knowledge, because pragmatics and linguistics are closely related to each other, and it is highly recommended that teachers should not separate the teaching of linguistics feature to pragmatics feature. And in this study, it's very interesting to see that there were two teacher educators uh, who consider that pragmatic knowledge is indispensable for language learner. And actually, those teacher educators were those who has conducted research into pragmatics. Therefore, to them, pragmatic competence was not merely a dimension of knowledge that student teacher needed to have, but it was a factor that determined the success of learner communication in the target language. So this means that for teacher educator who has knowledge in pragmatics, they could position pragmatics in its adequate position. Now let me go on with the research finding to research question number 2, in which I look at Vietnamese teacher educator knowledge and belief about the constituent of L2 pragmatic competence in relation to intercultural communication. So first of all, except for one teacher educator who held the viewpoint of pragmatic competence as a constituent of intercultural communicative competence, all of the remaining teacher educators share the componential view about pragmatic competence, in which it was considered a component of the overall communicative competence. This showed us the teacher educator under this study still held a traditional views of pragmatics. Also, all teacher educators share the belief that reservist teachers needed to be taught basic pragmatic aspects exclusively. According to them, basic pragmatic aspects included speeches, politeness, conversation management, and general cultural principle, in which the first two aspects received more teacher educator attention. This suggested that what were considered as basic pragmatic knowledge by them were actually the pragmatic aspects that are familiar to them. And also, regarding the teacher educators' knowledge and belief of the specific component of L2 pragmatic competence, it was seen that the teacher educators still holds the traditional viewpoint of pragmatics, in which only the concept of pragmatics within individual, as presented in Figure 1 above, was acknowledged. Now I will talk about the relationship between teacher-educator knowledge, belief, and practices of L2 pragmatic teachings. So in this study, it was analyzed that teacher-educator practices of L2 pragmatic teachings was affected by different factors. So regarding the relationship between teachers' knowledge and their practices, it was found that apparently teachers with more knowledge of pragmatics tend to include more pragmatics in their teaching. However, this is not always the case, because in some cases of teacher educators, it will found that even though they have knowledge of pragmatics, they still decided not to include a lot of pragmatics into their teachings, because they held some kind of belief that inhibits them from pragmatic teaching. For example, as mentioned above, they believe that student teacher with low English proficiencies could not learn about pragmatics, and pragmatics can only be taught to students who have good proficiencies of the English language. Also, there are some teacher educators who think that pragmatic teachings is responsible by teachers who are in charge of the pragmatics courses exclusively. Also, the practices of teacher-educator L2 pragmatic teachings was also affected by other kind of contextual factor, just like the requirement from the curriculums and the department, because in this university, pragmatic teachings is not explicitly required by the department. So it's really depend on the teacher educator who could choose to include pragmatic teaching in their practices or not. And it also found that teacher with experience of research and self-study into pragmatics tend to include more pragmatics in their teachings. And one more interesting result is that for teacher who has experience of studying livings in English-speaking country, they has a lot of implicit learnings of pragmatics through their learning of English and their teaching of English. They also tend to integrate a lot of pragmatics into their teaching, but they still has problems connecting their experience and knowledge of pragmatics with the theoretical pragmatic knowledge. That's why they could not integrate pragmatics into their teaching practices systematically. So the research findings from the study show that the teacher educator under inquiry still holds the traditional viewpoint of L2 pragmatic competence, in which only pragmatics within individual was paid attention to. So to the teacher educators, L2 pragmatic competence only consists of the knowledge of pragmalinguistics and social pragmatics, and like as long as the student could be able to map these two kinds of knowledge onto each other, they could communicate appropriately in the target language. So as such, the two important aspects of pragmatics in interaction in context and pragmatic in intercultural communication were totally ignored by these teacher educators. So the research finding from the study suggested that teacher educator really need to be updated with current understanding of L2 pragmatics. So this is not only the case of the teacher under inquiry, but could be generalized into those from other similar contexts, because normally there is often a mismatch between what has been found in research and what is still in practice. This is the reason why teacher professional development is really crucial, so that teachers could be updated with new knowledge and informed with finding from research, so that they can integrate this new knowledge into their teaching practices effectively. Also, these studies show that it is really essential that teacher educator re-examines their misleading belief about the teaching of pragmatics and their student-teacher readiness to learn about it. So similarly, more work needs to be done in the future, so that these teachers, educators' misleading belief could be challenged regarding the pragmatics and its teaching. Um, in terms of the teacher-educator practices, it is recommended that there should be official requirement for teacher-educator to teach L2 pragmatics to pre-service teachers. This is because if in the curriculums, pragmatics is not explicitly required to be taught, teacher-educator may just ignore totally about it. So in conclusion, this studies show that although teacher educators were fully aware of the importance of L2 pragmatic competence in intercultural communication. Their knowledge, belief, and practices of L2 pragmatics to pre-service teachers really varied, so not all teacher educator would integrate L2 pragmatics in their teaching practices, and this is really the gaps that need to be filled so that pre-service teachers can be well trained in terms of L2 pragmatics and its teaching. And these are my references. Thank you very much for your listening.